Autumn always arrived suddenly in Hazelwood. Just yesterday, the air was thick and sweet, with the scent of ripe apples, and today it was torn by gusts of cold wind, carrying the scent of damp earth, mushrooms, and decay from old wood. For most residents of the small town, it was a time to stock up on firewood and insulate the windows. For Grandma Ellie, it was a time for her most important walks. Eleanor, or simply Ellie, as she asked to be called, even at 70 remained a vibrant, agile creature, more like a withered, sturdy vine than a frail old woman. Her life was dedicated to a quiet but passionate obsession, a dialogue with the forest. She was an ethnobotanist, and this science had long ceased to be just a job for her. It had become a way of perceiving the world. Ellie didn't simply study plants and the legends surrounding them. She listened to what the forest had to tell her. On that day, October the 12th, 1999, the skies over Hazelwood were low and leaden. The radio was broadcasting a severe storm warning that would hit the county that evening. Ellie's 15-year-old granddaughter, Lily, watched anxiously as her grandmother packed her old, worn leather field bag. "Grandma, could you stay?" Lily asked pleadingly, watching the dark clouds creep over the rooftops. "It's going to be terrible weather today." Ellie turned to face her. Her face, furrowed like a map of long-forgotten paths, was lit by a warm but distant smile. Her eyes, the color of a forest pool, glowed with the mysterious spark Lilia always saw when her grandmother was on the verge of some discovery. "Don't worry so much about old Ellie, dear." Her voice was the rustle of autumn leaves. "The forest is waiting for me. It whispers that the time has come, the most important time." She donned her signature khaki coat, a plaid wool scarf, and perched a pair of round, wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like an old, seasoned owl. She held her cane, once carved from an apple branch, the handle of which was stylized as a sleeping owl. "But what kind of important times could there be in such a storm?" Lilia persisted, feeling a cold lump of anxiety tightening in her throat. Ellie walked up to the window and placed her palm on the cold glass, as if feeling the very flesh of the approaching storm. "A storm is not a hindrance, my girl. It is the key. It washes away all that is superfluous, revealing the essence. It opens doors that are usually tightly closed." She turned and looked at Lily with such bottomless tenderness and sadness that the girl's heart sank. "If anything, if I am delayed, don't look for me in the forest. Look for me in the legends." With these words, she walked out the door, and the wind slammed it violently behind her. Lily ran to the window and watched her grandmother's dry, upright figure, cane in hand, walk down the street, wet from the first rain, heading for a dark chasm on the outskirts of town, the entrance to Old Wood Forest. Mrs. Evans, a neighbor who saw her from her porch, would later say that Ellie wasn't just walking quickly, she was walking with purpose, as if she were late for a date. She didn't turn around, didn't wave. She simply disappeared into the gloom between the tree trunks, accepted by the forest as an integral part of it. An hour later, the sky split open. The storm lashed Hazelwood with a fury the elders couldn't recall. Rain lashed horizontally. The wind snapped branches with the crack of gunshots, and the river overflowed its banks. When the storm died down toward nightfall, replaced by an alarming howl in the chimneys, Ellie hadn't returned. The anxiety in Lilia's heart grew into a chilling terror. Her father, his face gray with worry, called the sheriff. A night search with flashlights in the raging forest was madness and hopeless. It began at dawn. Dozens of volunteers combed Old Wood. They shouted her name, but the forest answered only with the echoes and rustle of falling leaves. They searched for tracks, scraps of clothing, any clue. But Old Wood, whose secrets Ellie had so cherished, proved mute and merciless. Not a single scrap of her plaid scarf, not a trace of her cane in the soggy earth, not a shard of her famous glasses. She was gone without a trace, as if a giant hand had erased the lonely old woman from the canvas of reality, leaving behind only questions, pain, and a gaping void in a house that smelled of dried herbs and old paper. For the authorities, it was a tragic disappearance, likely related to bad weather. For Lilia and her family, it was the collapse of a world. And for Hazelwood itself, it was a dark legend that began with simple words. "Remember old Miss Ellie, the one who talked to the trees?" She went into the woods and never came back. They say the woods kept her. The following days, weeks, and months merged into one continuous, agonizing wait. Hope, like autumn light, grew dimmer and colder with each passing day. At first, it was bright and burning. With each passing minute, you believed that any minute now, a branch would snap outside the door, and she would appear on the threshold, wet, tired, but alive, with some incredible story on her lips. Then the hope became quiet, almost superstitious. People began to believe in signs, in a rare butterfly found in the garden, in a strange pattern on a tree bark, in a dream they so desperately wanted to believe in. The search continued with formal, methodical ruthlessness. They combed old wood forest with dogs, who, having picked up a faint scent at the entrance to the thicket, soon lost it, circling in place with helpless yelps. The helicopter roared over the treetops, but the thick, not yet fully fallen canopy concealed everything beneath. In the marshy lowlands, they probed the bottom with poles, checking old hunting lodges and abandoned mines. The result was the same: nothing. The official versions constructed by the sheriff were as straightforward and joyless as the trunks of the pine trees. Theory 1. An accident. Despite her experience, Ellie could have slipped on the rain-wet clay, fallen, hit her head on a rock, and rolled into one of the many beaver ponds, her body swept away by the current. Or she could have suffered a sudden illness, a stroke, a heart attack. The forest was vast, and a lonely body could have gone unnoticed for years. Theory 2. Wild animal attack. Bears and cougars roamed the forest. Theoretically, one of them could have struck the old woman down with a single blow of its paw and dragged her off to its den. But the dog handlers found no clumps of fur, no signs of a struggle, no telltale smell of decomposition. Theory 3. Criminal. The least likely, but therefore the most frightening. Could some passing maniac, some local lunatic, have committed the crime? But there were no reports of suspicious individuals in the area. Ellie had no enemies, no money, no valuables. There was no motive. But for the town of Hazelwood, whose history was intertwined with that of Old Wood, there was a fourth version. It wasn't voiced during official interrogations. It was whispered in kitchens, over cups of tea, passed from mouth to mouth, like the legends Ellie once loved to collect. They spoke of old oaks, ancient spirits of the forest, the very ones that, according to legend, lived in the oldest trees. They were guardians, but jealous and stern guardians. They took away those who trespassed too deeply into their domain, who eavesdropped on their secrets, who tried to steal their magic. Ellie, with her endless wanderings, with her notebooks where she recorded not just the names of plants, but their whispers, with her attempts to find a grain of truth in the darkest tales. Wasn't she the perfect prey for such creatures? She knew too much about them, Mrs. Evans told her neighbor, nodding toward the forest. She crossed the line. The Starradubs decided her knowledge belonged to them. They kept her for themselves. These conversations reached the family. Lilia's father, a strictly practical man, grew angry and brushed them aside like annoying flies. But Lilia, sensitive and grief-stricken, listened. For her, this wasn't just a fairy tale. It was an attempt to explain the inexplicable. Death by a puma or falling into a river were too mundane, too brutal for Grandma Ellie. Disappearance by the will of ancient forces seemed more fitting, more worthy of her. By the end of 2001, the active search had finally ceased. Eleanor's case was downgraded to suspended and archived. Old Wood, which for Lilia had once been a place of wonder and adventure with her grandmother, had become a vast, silent tomb. It no longer whispered. It remained silent. Oppressive, complete, absolute. The family tried to move on. They took her coat from the hanger, but its ghostly silhouette remained on the wall. They stopped setting the table for her, but her chair remained forever empty. The pain didn't go away. It lurked, becoming the background noise of their lives, intensifying during autumn storms, when the wind howled, just as it had that day. Lily grew up. She left Hazelwood, went to university, and became an architect. She built new buildings, created new forms, trying to replace with creativity the emptiness left in the wake of destruction. But somewhere deep within, behind all the plans and calculations, dwelt the shadow of the old forest and the quiet, insistent whisper of an unsolved mystery. She promised herself that one day she would return, not to look for a body, but to find an answer, to understand where Grandma Ellie had truly gone, and whether her departure was the end or merely a transition to another chapter in that strange and beautiful book she called life. Almost 20 years have passed. Hazelwood, once a sleepy town, has gradually transformed into a trendy destination for lovers of quiet, outdoor recreation. Bike paths, craft shops, and, as the crowning achievement of this civilized development, the Ancestral Trail Project, a landscaped walking route that would run along the edge of Old Wood, making its secrets safe and accessible to tourists, have appeared. Lilia returned to the city at a professional invitation. Her firm had won a tender to design several observation decks along the new trail. The irony of fate was bitter and perfect. She, the granddaughter of a woman consumed by the forest, was now helping to tame it, to fit it into a human-friendly framework. That day, she was inspecting the initial stage of the work. Bulldozers and excavators rumbled deafeningly as they tore into the clearing, clearing away the debris of fallen trees over the winter and creating a wide, compacted gravel path. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and freshly cut wood. Work was in full swing at the foot of a giant elm. The tree was a true patriarch of the forest, its trunk blackened by time and weather, and its mighty roots, like stone snakes, slithered into the earth. The excavator operator, a young man in a bright orange helmet, carefully lifted his bucket to free a rotting log lodged among the roots. His steel claw dug into the soil, revealing clumps of dark, damp earth mixed with stones and white threads of mycelium. Something glittered in the dim autumn light, not flashy, not like glass, but dull, like time-polished metal. "Hey, look at this!" "Yes," the operator shouted, turning off the engine. He jumped out of the seat and bent down. Lily, standing to the side, with a tablet in her hands, instinctively looked in the same direction and froze. The worker held a pair of glasses, round, with a thin metal frame. One arm was bent almost at a right angle. The lenses were intact, but covered in a dense, intricate network of cracks, like a spider's web. They hadn't been shattered by the impact. It seemed as if some unknown force were pushing them apart from within, causing the glass to become covered in this deathly icy ripple. They were cloudy, opaque, bearing the imprint of something inexplicable. "Looks like an antique," the guy chuckled, handing the find to Lilia. "Someone must have lost it here a long time ago." Lily held her breath. She recognized them instantly as she would have recognized her grandmother's voice after 20 years of silence. They were those very glasses, Grandma Ellie's glasses. Her fingers trembled as she took them. The metal was cold as ice. The network of cracks was surprisingly smooth to the touch. She turned them over in her hands, and a beam of light fell at a certain angle. And then it happened. For a second, for a brief flicker, the dense web of cracks seemed to part. In the murky depths of the glass, she saw not her own reflection, but another face, pale, frightened, with wide eyes. It was Ellie's face, not calm and peaceful, but caught off guard in the very moment of profound amazement and horror. Lily gasped and nearly dropped her glasses. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only a chilling sensation in her fingers and a racing heart. "Miss Reynolds, are you all right?" the foreman asked, worriedly. Yes, everything's fine," she managed to say, squeezing the cold metal in her palm. "Just an old find." She stepped aside, leaning her back against the cold body of the truck. Adrenaline pulsed in her temples. This wasn't just evidence. It was a message, distorted, encrypted in the broken glass, but a message nonetheless. Grandma hadn't simply dropped them in her fall. Something had happened to them. Something that had left this strange, non-physical scar on them. Something that had imprinted her last, frozen expression on them. She looked at the glasses again. Now they were just old, damaged glasses. But Lily knew. She saw. The forest, after 2 decades, had finally begun to speak, but its language was not words, but cracks in the glass and reflections from another time. The silence of Old Wood was broken, and the truth it was beginning to reveal was far more terrifying and inexplicable than any theory of an accident or a wild animal attack. The glasses lay on the table in her temporary apartment in Hazelwood, and Lilia couldn't take her eyes off them. They radiated a quiet, unhealthy energy, like a radioactive artifact. Every time she looked at the web of cracks, she waited with bated breath for that frightened face to flash again. But the lenses remained simply clouded and shattered. The vision was a one-time key, clicking into the lock of her perception, never to be repeated. She knew she couldn't entrust this discovery to the authorities. The sheriff who replaced the previous one would listen politely and perhaps even add points to the case, but the reflection story would be chalked up to stress and imagination. No, this secret was hers alone, a legacy her grandmother had left her. The next day, Lilia climbed up to the attic of her parents' house, which was now empty. The air was thick and sweet with the scent of old wood and dust. Here, in the corner, under a dusty tarp, were boxes of her grandmother's things. Her parents had never been able to unpack them. She opened the first box. Botany books, their bindings cracked with age, files of dried plants, their petals crumbling at the slightest touch, and journals, dozens of thick, leather-bound notebooks covered in Ellie's neat, cramped handwriting. Lily settled down on an old chest and began to read. It was an immersion into another world, into her grandmother's mind. She wasn't just describing plants, she was describing their character. St. John's wort is a solar warrior, its strength in the stubbornness with which it fights its way toward the light, she wrote. The fern is an ancient keeper of secrets. It speaks only to those willing to listen to the whispers of the shadows. But the most interesting things were found in separate, smaller notebooks, her field diaries. They weren't just records of routes, they were synchronicity maps, as she called them. On her homemade old wood maps, she included not only trails and streams, but also patterns, spirals, concentric circles, arrows. Alongside them were excerpts from local legends, notes about weather anomalies, and strange dreams she had after visiting certain places. And so, in a diary from 1999, she found it. The page was covered with notes and calculations, and in the center was a map of a section of forest near a giant elm. And on it, exactly in the place where the glasses had been found, was inscribed the very symbol she had seen in earlier entries, a spiral smoothly turning into a stylized tree. Underneath it was a signature written with particular care, the gate of the sleeping leaf, a place where time flows differently, locus temporis. Lilia's heart began to beat faster. She frantically flipped through the pages, finding every reference to this place. In one place, Ellie wrote about a cold zone, a sudden drop in temperature she'd recorded there on a windless day. In another, about a compass anomaly where the needle pointed not toward magnetic north, but seemed to reach for the tree itself. She recorded her observations of animal behavior. Birds avoided the area, squirrels didn't build nests there, and there were theoretical considerations. Ellie cited the works of theoretical physicists, parapsychologists, and mythologists. She hypothesized that there exist places on Earth, nodes, where the boundary between worlds, between different time streams, thins. She called them gates, and the legend of the sleeping leaf, a mythical flower that awakens once a century, was, in her opinion, not an allegory but a distorted memory of a real physical phenomenon, the moment of flowering of the gate itself, its brief activity. Lilia leaned back, trying to digest what she'd read. Her grandmother wasn't just some eccentric old woman. She was an explorer of the unknown, a scientist who boldly stepped beyond the boundaries of accepted science. She wasn't just going for a walk that day, she was going on an experiment. She knew the gate was supposed to activate, and the storm, her grandmother had written that powerful energetic disturbances in the atmosphere could serve as a catalyst. It all fit. Too crazy to be true, too logical to be coincidence. Ellie's grandmother had deliberately stepped into something inexplicable, and the glasses, those strange, illogical cracks, they weren't the result of a fall. They were evidence of what happened when the gate opened. They were at the epicenter of an event that warped their very fabric, capturing, like a photographic plate, the last instant before Ellie crossed the threshold. Lily looked at the glasses lying on the table. They weren't just evidence anymore. They were a map, a key, and a warning all rolled into one. Grandmother had achieved her goal, but what had she found on the other side of the gate? And was it a one-way trip? Lilia spent the next few days immersed in the chaos of the archives. She wasn't just reading anymore, she was searching, plucking every scrap of information related to the gate and the sleeping leaf from the flood of words and sketches. Her grandmother's notes transformed from bizarre observations into a coherent theory, frightening in its logic. The sleeping leaf wasn't a plant in the traditional sense. In the earliest folklore accounts Ellie collected from elders, it was described as a flower's shadow, a ghost plant. It was said to be impossible to pick or plant. It would appear in a specific location, taking shape only for a moment, once every 100 years, only to vanish immediately. Those who saw it described a feeling of immense peace and at the same time a poignant longing for something irrevocably lost. But Ellie went beyond fairy tales. In her later analytical notes, the sleeping leaf was no longer a biological species, but a physical phenomenon. She called it the visible heart of the anomaly, a byproduct of a space-time distortion. At the peak of the gate's activity, she claimed, the laws of physics at that point would slightly soften, and through a rift in reality, a light, a form, an entity from another dimension or time layer would briefly emerge. It was this moment that people saw, mistaking it for a flower. It doesn't grow out of the ground, Ellie wrote in the margins of one of her physics and mathematics calculations. It grows out of the very fabric of existence. It's a symptom of the sickness of reality in this place. Lilia struggled through the complex formulas and terms, but the general idea was clear. Her grandmother believed she had found a place where reality was thinner than anywhere else, and she had learned to predict his moments of greatest vulnerability. In the diary, a few weeks before her disappearance, the tone of her entries shifted from theoretical to feverishly practical. Ellie made complex calculations based on lunar phases, solar activity, geomagnetic storms, and even her own measurements of the local energy levels. She calculated the exact date and time when the gate would open with maximum force. That date fell on October 12, 1999, that very day. The last entry in the diary, made on the morning of October 12th, was short and full of determination. The calculations are correct. All the parameters match. The anomaly will peak with the onset of the storm. The energy surge will serve as a catalyst and camouflage. I must be there. If the legend is right, I will be able to not only see it, I will be able to step inside, beyond the threshold. Do what no scientist before me has managed. See what lies beyond the veil. If I do not return, then the theory was correct. Look for the answer here, in these records. Lilia slowly closed the notebook. Her palms were damp. Now, everything fell into place. Grandmother wasn't a passive victim of the elements. She was a willing explorer, consciously taking incredible risks. She was using the storm, its electromagnetic and possibly temporal disturbances, as part of her experiment. She wasn't simply waiting for the sleeping leaf to appear. She intended to pass through the gate itself. And the glasses, now their strange state, took on a terrifying logic. They weren't broken. They were changed. Situated at the epicenter of a yawning reality, they were subjected to forces that warped matter itself. The web of cracks wasn't damage, but a trace, a scar left by the transition. And the reflection she saw, perhaps it wasn't just a snapshot of fear, perhaps it was an actual projection, captured for a split second in the warped glass, from the spot where Ellie had stepped, her last glimpse of our world, trapped in an artifact that had been on both sides of the veil. Lilia looked up at the glasses lying on the table. They no longer frightened her. They filled her with awe. This wasn't just a clue to the disappearance, it was a trophy brought back from the edge of the known world, proof that Ellie's grandmother had achieved her goal. She had found her sleeping leaf, but the price of discovery was the greatest imaginable. A hunger for information drove Lilia forward. The theories laid out in the diaries were brilliant, but they remained theories. She needed a witness, someone who knew her grandmother and her obsession not as family, but as a comrade, or conversely, a skeptic. In the old entries, she came across a name Ellie mentioned with unfailing respect, and sometimes with a hint of annoyance. Mr. Aldridge. Arthur Aldridge was the forester at Oldwood for 40 years, and after retiring, he became a hermit, settling in a modest hut on the very edge of the forest. He was one of the few whose knowledge of the forest rivaled Ellie's own, but their approaches differed. He was a practitioner, a keeper. She was a theorist, a seeker. Finding his hut proved difficult. It stood off to the side of all paths, overgrown with wild grapes, as if the very earth itself were trying to hide it from prying eyes. The old man sat on the porch, peeling potatoes and gazing at the forest with a calm, all-seeing gaze. He was thin and sinewy, like the root of an old tree. "Mr. Aldridge," Lilia called out to him quietly. He turned his head slowly, his eyes the color of wet stone, studying her without surprise. You look like her, like Eleanor." His voice creaked like brushing branches. "I'm her granddaughter, Lily." He nodded and gestured for her to sit on the step. She showed him the glasses. He took them in his calloused hands, turned them over, ran his finger over the web of cracks, and something akin to understanding and sadness flickered across his face. "So she did it after all," he whispered. "She found the gate." Lily held her breath. He knew. "Did she talk to you about this?" "Of course. We argued until we were hoarse. I told her, 'Ellie, some doors are not meant to be opened. They are boundary posts, a warning.' And she replied, 'Arthur, science cannot advance without crossing boundaries.' She saw this as a great discovery, and I saw the greatest danger." He handed the glasses back and stared at the forest. "The sleeping leaf, it's not a plant, my child. It's a guardian, a sentinel, like a red light at a crossing. Its appearance is the final warning. Stop. This is foreign territory. It's a mark on a fragile spot, a sign that reality is leaking here." "But what's beyond the gate?" Lilia asked, her voice trembling. Aldridge shook his head. "Who knows? Another time? A parallel world? Pure, unstructured energy? Our brains aren't designed to comprehend it." Ellie believed it was a different ecological niche, like a treetop or the depths of the sea. She was ready to explore it. But a door that opens rarely closes properly. He looked at Lily, and bottomless pity was visible in his eyes. "She was not a victim, my child. She was a volunteer, a pioneer. The storm was not the cause, but the instrument. She used its energy to burn through the veil. But such transitions, they are rarely reversible. Perhaps she was stuck, like a fly in amber, between worlds, between here and there." His words hung in the air, heavy and joyless. They confirmed her worst suspicions. This wasn't murder or an accident. This was a disappearance in a different fundamental sense. Why did she leave her glasses behind?" Lilia asked, clutching the cold metal in her hand. "The matter of our world can't always pass through," the old man explained, "especially the fragile, lifeless kind. Perhaps they were thrown back when the gate slammed shut, like a cork being pushed out of a bottle. They absorbed the echo of that transition. These cracks, they're not cracks. They're a scar of reality, an imprint of what lies on the other side." Lilia thanked him and walked away, feeling the ground shift beneath her. She had found the answer, but it brought no relief. There was no villain to punish, no body to mourn. There was only the cold, inexorable truth. Her grandmother, driven by a thirst for knowledge, had stepped into the unknown and found herself trapped in a crack between worlds. And her glasses weren't just evidence. They were a cry for help, frozen in glass and metal, a message from a place where no messages should be. The truth Mr. Aldridge brought didn't free Lilia. It settled inside her like a heavy, cold stone. There was no guilt, no malice, not even a clear line between truth and madness. There was only the lonely figure of her grandmother, who had knowingly stepped into an abyss whose existence only a few knew existed. Lily returned to that very elm. Work on the ancestral trail had paused for the weekend, and the forest had once again descended into its pristine silence. The giant tree stood as if nothing had happened, its blackened bark bearing no visible scars from recent technological intrusion or long-ago disappearance. The air was cold and still. She took out her glasses. This time, she didn't look for a reflection in them. She simply held them in her hand, feeling their unnatural heaviness. They were an artifact, a relic of an event beyond human comprehension. Having gathered all the evidence, the diaries, the maps, Aldridge's testimony, and this strange discovery, Lilia came to the only possible conclusion. Grandmother Ellie had achieved her goal. She had proven her theory, found the sleeping leaf, as she understood it, not a mythical flower, but a transition point. She used the storm as a key and crossed the threshold, but the door slammed behind her. Perhaps the energy was insufficient, or the gate's structure itself was unstable. The result was the same. She could not return. Her glasses, discarded at the moment of the portal's collapse, became material evidence, crystallizing the very moment of transition. Her last look, her amazement and horror. There was no room for justice here. There was no one to be angry with, no one to blame. There was only cruel irony. The greatest discovery of Ellie's life became the cause of her disappearance. She became an eternal prisoner of her own curiosity, a hostage to the very boundary she sought. Lily slowly knelt at the very roots of the elm. She placed the glasses on the dark, mossy stone, right next to where they had been found. Keeping them would have been pointless, even sacrilegious. They belonged to this place. They were a part of it, its guardian and its monument. She didn't utter a single word. What could one say at such a moment? Goodbye? But Grandma wasn't dead in the usual sense. She was existing differently. She stood where time flowed, according to different laws, looking at them, at this world, through the very veil she had longed to lift. Lily stood and took a step back. The forest was silent, but this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was rich, full of an unspoken presence. The wind stirred the treetops, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadowy silhouette flicker between the trunks. Not ghostly or frightening, just a silhouette, tall, straight, with kind and infinitely sad eyes. It was there for only a split second, and then vanished, merging with the pattern of light and shadow. It wasn't a farewell, it was a confirmation. Lily turned and walked away, back to the city, to her life, to her plans. She found no peace, but she had found the truth. And this truth was more bitter than any lie about the accident. She knew that Grandma Ellie had found what she was looking for and paid the ultimate price for it. There would be no justice. She could only accept this secret and carry it with her. And sometimes, on the quietest evenings, when the wind from old wood howled especially mournfully through the wires, Lily would feel someone's gaze on her, gentle, filled with a longing for a home that could no longer be found on any map.